The epidemiology of these illnesses really helps with the diagnosis, and often I will see a history that is simply inconsistent with manic depression because of the time course and the exact nature of the symptoms and the person's age and their mental status examination. That's also very important. If a person tells me they were manic last night and on their exam, their objective examination, their affect, their psychomotor activity, their thought process, these are not questions the patients are answering. These are parameters that the clinician is observing directly. If there's no evidence of mania on your exam today, you were not manic last night. Particularly if there's no mood stabilizer on board, the likelihood that the mania would have resolved completely overnight is virtually nil, and that's one way that I often rule out that diagnosis, that patients will use that terminology and they're using the incorrect term. Which brings me to another point in terms of history taking. Patients will often report racing thoughts, and what they mean 99 times out of 100 is that they're lying in bed thinking, unable to shut their thinking off. And they'll describe that as racing thoughts because they've heard clinicians use that term. And what they mean is that they can't shut their mind off. They're thinking about things, what happened that day, what they have to do tomorrow. That's not mania. That's not racing thoughts. Racing thoughts are where you have psychomotor agitation, too much dopamine, and so your thoughts are actually racing. They're sped up, and that manifests as pressured speech, flight of ideas, the subjective sense that you can't speak fast enough to get those thoughts out. And that insight isn't always there. There are patients that are psychomotor agitated, they're speaking very rapidly, that don't have the subjective sense that they need to speak quickly in order to get their thoughts out, because they may simply lack that insight. If they're going at a certain speed, speed is relative, and so they may not appreciate that they are speaking loudly or quickly, or that they're gesticulating. Often I'll see that as well. They're just being very, very animated, and they're not aware of it because subjectively, it's just like in physics, in their reference frame, and it's only the objective clinician that looks at that person and knows immediately. And then also we look at what themes their speech contains. And we see mood congruent themes. We see themes of grandiosity, of spirituality, expansiveness. These individuals will often approach strangers with confidence and as though they've known each other for a long time. Putting all of these elements together can help. The history is rarely unequivocal, and that's really what we have to look for. If a person's not manic when they come to be evaluated. So when I hear about mood swings that last hours to days and then going out and spending too much money in shopping and quote-unquote racing thoughts, I'm not impressed by any of that. I want to hear about psychomotor agitation. I want to hear about impulsivity that is a marked deviation from their baseline and from who they normally are, their character. It always helps if I can interview family members, and certainly if there's been psychosis or even extreme mania without psychosis, the history is unequivocal. Family history is another important element because of all of the mental disorders, in my experience, bipolar disorder is strongly familial. In as much as it's always difficult to confirm a family history because that other family member is not there to be examined and interviewed, and we often don't have all of the details regarding their treatment, and so it's often difficult to confirm a family history of any disorder. It helps if the family member was hospitalized, but it also helps if their symptoms were so dramatic, so remarkable and unequivocal that we can safely say that that behavior was manic behavior. So when I hear about someone's uncle running through the streets naked, I know that that person was manic. I don't know if he was manic because he was high on drugs or if he's bipolar, but I know that running through the streets naked, saying that you are Jesus, that's mania. And so it helps in the context of evaluating an individual. Depression is easy. Depression, we all understand what that is, and assuming that the patient is being reliable, then we know what depression is. We know what it feels like: low energy, low mood, negative outlook, sometimes tearfulness, suicidal thoughts sometimes. There are often mood-congruent feelings of guilt. There's a low sex drive. There is an appetite disturbance, either increased or decreased. Problems sleeping, either too much or too little. Those are neurovegetative symptoms. All of that's clues that the depression is biologic. And that's really the only diagnostic dilemma when a person reliably reports depressive symptoms is it endogenous depression, or is it an adjustment disorder? Is it situational? And sometimes it's a mixture. Or is it substance-induced? We have to rule out chemical dependency. And are there symptoms and behaviors complicated by character pathology, by a personality disorder with poor coping skills and maladaptive attitudes? But mania is more difficult to diagnose by history unless it's been so extreme that the person can report more than just shopping sprees and racing thoughts at night when they're trying to get to bed. The fact that someone's laying in bed trying to shut their mind off, trying to go to sleep, but can't stop thinking about all the things they need to do, that's not mania. The manic individual would not be in bed trying to sleep, worrying about the next day. The manic individual would be staying up all night, cleaning the house from top to bottom. And sometimes we see that in individuals who are abusing stimulants. They don't complain of mood problems, but the family member says, last night, my wife was up at 3 in the morning vacuuming the entire house, and then she went outside and started washing the windows. That is mania. And the next step is to figure out, well, is it cocaine-induced mania? Is it bipolar disorder? If it's bipolar disorder, and that was last night, then there are going to be signs of psychomotor agitation and an elevated mood in the clinician's office the next day. If instead the patient looks exhausted and disheveled and sleepy, then that person was abusing a stimulant the night before, because they are now in withdrawal. And the last thing I'll say is there are certain behaviors, certain psychotic behaviors that are pathognomonic for the abuse of stimulants. There's a paranoia that has a certain flavor that is unmistakable when a person is literally peering through the blinds and insists that there are people outside, intruders that are trying to get into the home, and especially if they call the police to report this. They call 911 and police actually show up to the home. Many times individuals who are abusing amphetamines and cocaine end up getting arrested because they call the police on themselves. And so when I hear that behavior, that the person's convinced that there's somebody up in the attic, or they're turning off the lights and they're speaking in low tones because they're convinced that somebody's listening in on them, and they're peering through the shutters, and call 911. But the next day or a few days later, there's no evidence of mania, there's no evidence of psychosis. And even in those patients that deny abusing cocaine or other stimulants and who are negative on drug testing, that's a false negative result, which can happen within 72 hours. And that behavior is attributable to the abuse of stimulants. Even in individuals with primary psychotic disorders like schizophrenia and major mood disorders like major depression and bipolar disorder who abuse stimulants and who report that behavior of hiding in their own homes, turning off the lights, whispering and looking out the window, that is always due to cocaine or methamphetamine.